Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents All This Marvelous Potential, Robert Kennedy's 1968 Tour of Appalachia, by Matthew Algeo, read by David Colacci. The Dreamer, by Lawrence Baldridge. He came a light to our mountains, a young man burdened with personal tragedy and pained with a nation's lost direction in a war that consumed youth, idealism, and a nation's dignity. He came a light to our mountains, in a nation divided by class and prejudice, and had himself championed civil rights for all, whatever one's class or creed or color. He came a light to our mountains, on unpaved roads, past humble dwellings, down endless hollers, and this dreamer, this Joseph, found himself inside another dream, the dream of Alice Lloyd of Boston, our college founder. He came a light to our mountains, and spoke eloquently and passionately to the students of Alice Lloyd, and they dreamed with him, dreamed of peace among nations, of goodwill to all mankind. He came a light to our mountains, and seemed so much at home. He spoke here, walked here, slept here, ate here. Robert Kennedy came to Caney Creek, and the light still shines. Robert F. Kennedy's Itinerary. All times are approximate. Tuesday, February 13, 1968. 11 a.m. Arrives at Bluegrass Airport in Lexington on Eastern Airlines Flight 659. Is greeted by former Kentucky Governor Albert Benjamin Happy Chandler. 11:30 a.m. Departs the airport in a state-owned vehicle provided by Kentucky's recently elected Republican Governor Louis Nunn. A state trooper is behind the wheel. Riding along are Congressman Carl D. Perkins and Steve Cawood, a University of Kentucky law student. A large caravan of reporters follows. 1 p.m. Arrives at the one-room schoolhouse in Vortex, Wolfe County, where he convenes a one-man hearing of the Senate Subcommittee on Empowerment, Manpower, and Poverty. Among those testifying are Swango Fugate, a disabled miner from Breathitt County, and Mary Rice Ferris, an African-American activist from Madison County. 2:30 p.m. Visits poor families in Breathitt and Wolfe counties. Inspects the one-room schoolhouse in Barwick, Breathitt County, where he meets the teacher, Bonnie Jean Carroll, and her students. 3:30 p.m. Tours Liberty Street, the predominantly African-American neighborhood in Hazard, Perry County. 5 p.m. Inspects a strip mine at Yellow Creek, near Vico, Perry County. 7 p.m. Arrives at Alice Lloyd College in Pippa Passes, Knott County. Holds a 90-minute question-and-answer session with approximately 200 students in the school's auditorium, and overnights in the home of one of the college's vice presidents. Wednesday, February 14, 1968. 8 a.m. Delivers brief remarks on the steps of the Letcher County Courthouse in Whitesburg. 10 a.m. Convenes a hearing of the Subcommittee on Employment, Manpower, and Poverty in the gymnasium of Fleming Neon High School in Neon, Letcher County. Among those testifying are Tommy Duff, a senior at Everts High School in neighboring Harlan County, and David Zagier, the manager of Bethlehem Steel's mining subsidiary in eastern Kentucky. 1:30 p.m. Departs Neon, visits families in Jackhorn, McRoberts, and Haymond, Kentucky. 4 p.m. Delivers brief remarks on the steps of the Floyd County Courthouse in Prestonburg, Kentucky. 4:30 p.m. Flies from a small airport near Prestonburg to Louisville on Governor Nunn's plane. 6 p.m. Attends a reception in his honor at the home of Mary and Barry Bingham, Sr., publishers of the Louisville Courier. Introduction. The Appalachian Mountains were formed about 3 billion years ago, when all the continents came together to form a single giant supercontinent that geologists call Pangaea. Somewhere along the Carolina coast, Africa smashed into North America, albeit at a speed so slow as to confound human comprehension, and crumpled the eastern half of what is now the United States. Waves of mountains rose up. Over the ensuing 2 billion years, the weight of the mountains pressed down on deep layers of dead and decomposing organic matter, mostly prehistoric plants, squeezing out the oxygen and turning the mush into peat, which, after another few 100 million years, turned into a carbon-based black rock that burns slowly and emits tremendous heat. Coal. The Appalachians may have once stood as tall as the Himalayas stand today. Time has worn them down, but they are still formidable, and they are still pressing down and squeezing in ways both literal and figurative. Just over 50 years ago, in February 1968, Robert Kennedy, a U.S. Senator born into great wealth and privilege, went to the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky to meet with people born at the opposite end of the social and economic spectrum: disabled coal miners, single and widowed mothers, children whose parents could not afford to feed them adequately. The trip occurred at a pivotal moment in American history. The Tet Offensive had launched just weeks before, and at a pivotal moment in Robert Kennedy's life. He was mulling a run for the presidency. For 2 days, Kennedy traveled hundreds of miles up and down the hills and hollows of eastern Kentucky on what the press dubbed a poverty tour. He visited one-room schoolhouses and dilapidated homes. He held a public hearing in a ramshackle high school gymnasium, sitting behind a wooden table set up in the foul lane. He toured a strip mine and spoke at a small mountain college. As acting chairman of a Senate subcommittee on poverty, Robert Kennedy went to Kentucky to gauge the progress of the war on poverty launched 4 years earlier by his brother's successor, Lyndon Johnson. Robert Kennedy wasn't merely on a fact-finding mission, however. A cold political calculus was at work, too. Kennedy was considering challenging President Johnson for the Democratic presidential nomination, but he would need support from white voters to win it. Kennedy's main constituencies were dispossessed minorities: African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans. He needed to form a coalition between them and working-class whites. "Let's face it," he told a reporter, "I appeal best to people who have problems." His trip to eastern Kentucky was a dry run for his presidential campaign, an opportunity to test his anti-war and anti-poverty message with hardscrabble whites. He was greeted by what one biographer has described as a mixture of adulation and loathing. Young people mobbed him like he was a beetle, begging him for autographs and tousling his own famous mop top. Their parents, however, were more circumspect. Frustrated by the government's continued inability to improve their lives, and by years of unkept promises, they warned Kennedy of a growing anger toward Washington. A month after his visit, Kennedy officially announced he was challenging Johnson for the Democratic nomination. 4 months after his visit, he was murdered. He was 42. He was survived by his wife, Ethel, and their 10 children. Their 11th child would be born 6 months after his death. This is the story of Robert Kennedy's visit to the mountains of eastern Kentucky in the turbulent and chaotic winter of 1967-68, when Vietnam and Peggy Fleming competed for headlines, the Beatles were at the top of the charts, with Hello Goodbye, and the nation's unrest reached deep into Appalachia. It's also the stories of the people Kennedy touched in his brief time there, and how the trip continues to reverberate in the lives and communities in ways large and small, even all these years later. Part 1. Before the Trip. 1. Night. The cover of the January 12, 1968 issue of Life magazine, price 35 cents, featured Faye Dunaway, co-star of one of that winter's most popular and controversial films, Bonnie and Clyde, in a long cardigan suit and a 1930s-style beret, an ensemble inspired by the film. Faye is a perfectionist and a worrier, the accompanying profile noted. She won't eat and mostly ignores the glasses of tab she orders one after another. Far less glamorous was another article in the issue, titled "These Murdered Old Mountains." It told Life's 7 million readers of the devastation wrought by strip mining in eastern Kentucky. Appalachia had been discovered by the mass media 5 years earlier, when Harry Caudill published Night Comes to the Cumberlands, a biography of a depressed area, his searing indictment of eastern Kentucky's mining industry. Born in Whitesburg, Letcher County, in 1922, Caudill's roots in eastern Kentucky ran deep. His grandfather's grandfather, James Caudill, was one of the first white settlers in what would become Letcher County in 1792. Harry Caudill served as an infantryman in Italy during the Second World War and was awarded a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. His left foot was so badly mangled by shell fragments that he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. After the war, he attended law school at the University of Kentucky, then returned to Whitesburg and opened a one-man law practice. Most of his clients were poor, and he came to know their problems well. He also served 3 two-year terms as a Democratic state representative between 1954 and 1962, an experience he found dispiriting. He sponsored a bill to limit strip mining, but by the time it became a law, it had been larded with so many loopholes that he declared it damn near worthless. He did not hold his fellow lawmakers in high esteem. Of all American politicians, he later wrote, the small-bore officials who run the states are the most greedy and the least scrupulous. He didn't care much for the electorate either. In an essay he wrote for Harper's Magazine in 1960, he said he was elected to the legislature only after paying off citizens of my district with the money and whiskey they demanded in return for their votes. The essay was published anonymously. Given to verbal grandiloquence, "What an inspired surprise," he'd thunder when he answered the phone. "To what do I owe the signal honor of this communication?" Caudill was a gifted writer. He said he decided to write Night in the spring of 1960, when he was asked to speak at an 8th-grade graduation ceremony at a coal camp school. The 7 graduates received their diplomas in the dilapidated 2-room building which had sheltered 2 generations of their forebears. One of the graduates had been orphaned by a mining accident, and the father of another wheezed and gasped with silicosis. The fathers of 3 others were jobless. The little ceremony was opened with the singing of America the Beautiful, our most patriotic hymn. The irony of the words, sung so lustily in such a setting, inspired the writing of this book. He dictated the manuscript to his wife, Anne, and sent it to his friends Mary and Barry Bingham Sr., the publishers of the Louisville Courier-Journal, who sent it to their son-in-law, A. Whitney Ellsworth, who was an editor for The Atlantic in New York. Ellsworth, who went on to become the first publisher of the New York Review of Books, forwarded the manuscript to the publisher Little Brown, which paid Caudill a $1,000 advance for the book. Night Comes to the Cumberlands was officially released on July 9, 1963. In 394 pages, bristling with anger and contempt, Caudill methodically indicted the timber and coal companies that devastated the landscape with clear cuts and strip mines, and the corrupt state and local officials who did nothing to stop them. Caudill was not opposed to coal mining per se. He even owned an interest in a small mining company, but he deplored strip mining, which he called a terrible new emasculation of the Cumberland Plateau's physical resources. Exploitation is a running theme in Night. Coal has always cursed the land in which it lies, Caudill wrote. When men begin to wrest it from the earth, it leaves a legacy of foul streams, hideous slag heaps, and polluted air. It peoples this transformed land with blind and crippled men, and with widows and orphans. It is an extractive industry which takes all away and restores nothing. It mars but never beautifies. It corrupts but never purifies. Caudle did not spare his neighbors in his critique. He criticized the mountaineers' tenacious anti-intellectualism, their exceptionally high birth rates, and their growing dependence on welfarism. He bemoaned the sustained flight of humanity from the mountains. As the more intelligent and ambitious people moved out of the plateau, the percentage of mental defectives relative to the total population rose sharply. In recent years, Knight has been criticized as anecdotal rather than rigorously academic. Caudle could be a sloppy researcher. He was given to quoting anonymous sources, and, like most raconteurs, he was prone to exaggeration. The historian David McCullough interviewed Caudle for a lengthy profile in American Heritage magazine in 1969. Afterward, an incredulous McCullough asked a mutual friend, Loyal Jones, whether everything Caudle had told him was true. "Well," Jones explained to McCullough, "there are two kinds of truth." Jones laughs as he tells me about the episode. It is a mild November day in 2018. We are chatting in his room at an assisted living facility in Richmond, Kentucky. His cat, a small orange tabby named Honey, keeps rubbing against my legs to get my attention. Born in 1928, Jones was one of 8 children of tenant farmers in Appalachian, North Carolina, who raised chickens and hogs and grew vegetables. "We had plenty to eat," Loyal says. "I hardly noticed the Great Depression." As the executive director of the Council of the Southern Mountains, an influential nonprofit agency, and later as the founder and director of the Appalachian Studies program at Berea College, Jones was at the center of the many dramas that played out as the war on poverty unfolded across Appalachia, and he knew Harry Caudle well. "Harry was a colorful writer and a great talker," he tells me. "He was a teller of tales in the Appalachian tradition of tall tales. I liked Harry and loved his stories. Nobody could have written Night Comes to the Cumberlands but Harry Caudle. It has defects, but it was the most important book about Appalachia in that era." Some of the writing in Night seems hopelessly dated today. A passing reference to the imported Mexican wetback is especially jarring. But Caudle was impressively prescient in places. He decried the infatuation with sports at the expense of academics. "Rare is the high school whose football coach is not paid far more than its chemistry, mathematics, and English teachers." He anticipated the opioid scourge by 4 decades, noting the families here and there enthralled to narcotics, and he lamented the fact that the federal government spent more on foreign aid than on development programs in Appalachia. "Men whose revolutionary forebears died for the slogan 'Death to Tyrants' have voted vast slush funds for Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy and one of the few lands where human chattel slavery is still legal." It hardly needs to be said that the book won Caudle few fans among his neighbors. As one reviewer noted, "What he has to say in Night Comes to the Cumberlands will not get him elected as the first citizen of Letcher County or any other county in eastern Kentucky." Privately, Caudle worried some harm might come to him or his family as a result of the book. Outside the mountains, however, the reviews were glowing. With devastating candor and clarity, dismay and disgust, humor and hope, Harry Caudle has taken a long look at the Cumberland Plateau, the Appalachian writer Wilma Dykeman wrote in the Chicago Tribune. "One hopes Night Comes to the Cumberlands will be widely read," wrote the Kentucky novelist Harriet Simpson Arno in her review in the New York Times. The book came to the attention of President John F. Kennedy, who urged his aides to read it. Sales were middling. The book made Caudle famous but not rich, yet Night Comes to the Cumberlands would take a place alongside Rachel Carson's Silent Spring as one of the most consequential books of the second half of the 20th century. In 2013, on the 50th anniversary of its publication, the Lexington Herald-Leader called Night a book that forever changed Appalachia. In October 1963, 3 months after Night was published, the veteran New York Times correspondent Homer Bigart, who'd won 2 Pulitzer Prizes covering the Second World War and the Korean War, went to eastern Kentucky to see for himself whether things were as bad as Harry Caudill claimed. They were. Bigart's story ran on the front page of the Sunday Times on October 20th, 1963. In the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Kentucky, it began, tens of thousands of unemployed coal miners and subsistence farmers face another winter of idleness and grinding poverty. Their jobs replaced by machines, the miners could find no work and subsisted on government handouts. So the mountains have become a vast ghetto of unemployables, Bigart wrote. Crowds of listless, defeated men hang around the county courthouses of the region. Bigart told of unemployed miners who feigned blindness to collect disability checks or abandoned their wives and children to make them eligible for relief. He saw mountainsides slashed with ugly terraces where bulldozers and steam shovels have stripped away the forest to get at the coal beneath, and creek beds littered with garbage, choked with boulders and silt dislodged by strip mine operations. One schoolhouse that he visited looked like an abandoned farm shed. The interior of the school was unfit for cattle. Daylight shone through gaping holes between rotted planks. Most of the tar paper on the outside was missing. There was a hole in the roof where the stovepipe should have been. Mrs. Stone, the teacher, Ruth Stone, said she could not light a fire because the pipe was missing. The stove was so badly cracked she was afraid to use it. Fortunately, the days had been warm, but cold weather was imminent. Everywhere Bigart went, he encountered malnourished children. "I've seen children who are pot-bellied and anemic," Randall D. Collins, the physician in charge of Letcher County's public health programs, told Bigart. "I've seen children eat dirt out of chimneys. Of 8,200 children in Letcher County, 75 to 85% are underweight." The federal government's new school lunch program offered no relief from hunger in schools without electricity or running water. The public health officer for Knott and Leslie counties estimated that 75% of the children in those counties had intestinal parasites, such as hookworm. Children throughout the region suffered from vitamin deficiencies. President Kennedy read Bigart's expose and was said to be shocked. He felt it was an intolerable situation for a nation rich enough to spend billions on foreign aid, the New York Times reported. Kennedy ordered his aides to propose an emergency relief package for eastern Kentucky before the winter set in. A $45 million aid package was sent to Congress in early November. It would not pass because conservatives objected to the cost. Meanwhile, JFK announced plans to visit eastern Kentucky to personally assess the situation there. The trip was scheduled for the following month, December 1963. At his last cabinet meeting before leaving for Dallas, Kennedy was doodling on a notepad. Over and over he wrote a single word: poverty. 2. Dysgenics. Harry Caudill not only catalogued Appalachia's many problems, he also proposed a solution: the creation of a Southern Mountain Authority, something akin to the Tennessee Valley Authority, the government-owned corporation created by Congress in 1933 to improve the lives of people living in Tennessee and portions of 5 bordering states. Ironically, it was the TVA's insatiable hunger for coal to fuel its power plants that contributed to eastern Kentucky's degradation. Widely considered the most successful New Deal program, the TVA oversaw numerous public works projects, rural electrification, flood control, reforestation, agricultural and industrial development that vastly improved living standards throughout the Tennessee Valley. Caudill believed a Southern Mountain Authority, a TVA for Appalachia, was the only solution to the region's problems. The experience of the TVA indicates that a Southern Mountain Authority created and financed by Congress for the purpose of bringing the region of the Southern Mountains abreast of the nation generally could accomplish the greater part of its mission in 2 or 3 decades, Caudill wrote in 1963. Of course, a Southern Mountain Authority was never created, although Congress did establish the Appalachian Regional Commission in 1965. While the ARC has accomplished much, by one estimate, the programs it funded reduced poverty in the region by 7.6% between 1960 and 2000. Eastern Kentucky still lags well behind the national averages in income, life expectancy, and education. Caudill came to consider the ARC a failure, and as he grew older he was gripped by the same hopelessness and despair he had so ably chronicled in Night Comes to the Cumberlands. The poverty that is associated with our region is accompanied by passivity and dependence, and I see no hope for allaying it, Caudill wrote in an August 1974 letter to the Nobel Prize-winning physicist turned amateur geneticist William Shockley. I have come full circle in my thinking and have reluctantly concluded that the poverty that called into being the Appalachian Regional Commission is largely genetic in origin and is largely irreducible. Caudill had come to embrace Shockley's theory of dysgenics, the belief that less intelligent people procreate faster than smarter people, resulting in a gradual dumbing down of the gene pool and ultimately the decline and fall of civilization. Shockley, a paranoid eccentric who shared the 1956 Nobel Prize in Physics for inventing the transistor, but had no formal training in genetics, also believed that white people were intellectually superior to black people, based on the results of IQ tests created and administered by white people. It was kooky, racist stuff, but Harry Caudill bought it, groping perhaps for a way to explain Eastern Kentucky's woes. In conclusion, I will say that I know absolutely nothing about the issue of white versus black intelligence, Caudill wrote Shockley. We have few blacks in this area, and practically all my observations have dealt with whites. There is no doubt in my mind at the present time that our welfare programs and general humanitarian principles and practices have contrived to effectively repeal the first law of nature, so that young and old alike survive to procreate. The dull, dependent, and welfare-supported are outbreeding the intelligent and the ambitious. This has, in my opinion, planted a deadly genetic time bomb in our society. Caudill and Shockley would meet later that year in Whitesburg to plan the implementation of a program of paid, voluntary sterilization in the mountains. Unsurprisingly, funding was nowhere to be found, and nothing ever came of it. Shockley died of prostate cancer in 1989. He was 79. Harry Caudill, diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, shot himself in the head while sitting underneath a hemlock tree in his yard a year later. He was 68. 3. Replace their despair. On the evening of Wednesday, January 8, 1964, just 47 days after the murder of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson delivered his first State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. Standing at the lectern in the well of the House of Representatives, with House Speaker John McCormack and Senator Carl Hayden, President pro tem of the Senate, seated behind him, Johnson outlined a progressive agenda that included more funding for schools, roads, and hospitals. The centerpiece, however, was what Johnson described as a war on poverty. Unfortunately, many Americans live on the outskirts of hope, some because of their poverty and some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. It will not be a short or easy.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?